President Joe Biden recently jogged up to reporters like an Elder Scrolls NPC, suddenly bringing up the need for him to formally apologize on behalf of the US federal government to the indigenous communities about Native American boarding schools. While certainly the apology was appreciated by some in said communities, it's clear that the public apology was made as a Hail Mary boost to the now defeated Kamala Harris campaign, especially when it has been revealed that President Biden abruptly and shamefully canceled 30-second appointments with leaders from Native American tribes that were scheduled after his apology speech.
We were invited on Wednesday to the event with the understanding that President Woodenknife would be speaking with President Biden for 30 seconds.
I didn't get to do my 30 seconds, which I really wanted to do because right now we're trying to do some things with rescinding the medals of honor from the massacre that occurred on our reservation.
Additionally, in making this a bittersweet moment, Biden's apology comes during a time when his administration is directly supplying Israel's ongoing genocide of Palestinians in the Middle East. But as a historian, I'm making this video not to discuss the apology itself, but rather the history behind the so-called American Indian boarding schools. These schools are among many subjects of US history never even taught or mentioned in most American curriculums for either public or private schools. Even at the higher levels of education, subject matter concerning interactions with indigenous peoples is often skimmed over or never mentioned, even in history courses that cover the United States specifically. In fact, I highly recommend checking out the sources listed in this video if you'd like to learn a bit more about such history in your free time. So, what are these boarding schools that Biden apologized for? In order to understand even just a little of the nature and intent of these schools, we have to go back and look at late 19th century America. In the years that followed the Californian Gold Rush and the US Civil War, large groups of settlers rapidly made their way through the western part of North America. People were looking to escape the depressions of a post-bellum America, hoping for cheap land or for greater opportunities in the West. And with these people came other markers of American civilization that would both innovate and tear apart much of the western landscape, such as the beginnings of a transcontinental railroad. Conflicts, of course, began and grew between the settlers and the many indigenous tribes that had inhabited the lands long before the peak of this westward expansion. Many people today think of the diminishment of all the indigenous peoples in North America as a singular genocide, while in reality, from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, there were multiple systemic genocides that devastated various peoples, like the Haudenosaunee, Yuki, Lakota, Ute, Aniyomiya, and so many more I can name that each would warrant entire courses worth of study. In perhaps one of the most well-known and heavily documented instances of genocide in modern history, the United States military, hand in hand with the railroad industry, would deliberately target the millions of bison that proudly roamed the plains of the West. Civil War veteran and General William Tecumseh Sherman emphasized to fellow General Sheridan that the extermination of the bison was essential to starve and drive out Indians in order to secure regions for railroad construction. Trained passengers would also be offered rifles and ammunition, for a fee of course, to shoot bison freely as a sport. The utter decimation of the bison, the wholesale destruction of entire ecosystems, forced removals, and by extension the ruination of the ways of life for so many people, including the Lakota Sioux, would put them at odds with the United States government. Many acts of resistances, massacres, and battles later, the American Indians were over, with humiliated and defeated tribes forced to live on the harshest, least desirable lands that still exist today in the form of Indian reservations, which are ironically still at risk of exploitation by both corporations and government. The late 19th century was also a turbulent time socially and culturally, with American societies scrambling for identity as other groups such as the Chinese, Mexicans, Germans, Italians, and others entered the picture. What did it mean to be American? Who is considered white in the US Census? Should citizenships be restricted based on ethnicity? And so on and so on. It should be noted that Black Americans and female Americans were also still fighting for rights in a post-Civil War America that was still reeling from the effects of heavy industrialization and rapid urbanization that had also taken the rest of the world by storm as humanity came closer to the 20th century. Much of what I'm describing here was sort of tackled by the administration of 21st US President Chester A. Arthur, a president that probably most people haven't heard of, and if they have, he's only well known for becoming president after the assassination of President James Garfield. What is remarkable about Arthur's presidency is that legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 18 1882 were attempts from his cohorts to respond to the changing times. And even more remarkable is that Arthur and the people in his administration somehow considered themselves progressive and humane on many matters, including how to handle the American Indian populations. In his first annual message to Congress on December 6 in 1881, President Arthur said, "Prominent among the matters which challenge the attention of Congress at its present session is the management of our Indian affairs. While this question has been a cause of trouble and embarrassment from the infancy of the government, it is but recently that any effort has been made for its solution at once serious, determined, consistent, and promising success. It has been easier to resort to convenient makeshifts for tiding over temporary difficulties than to grapple with the great permanent problem, and accordingly, the easier course has almost invariably been pursued. It was natural at the time when the national territory seemed almost illimitable and contained many millions of acres far outside the bounds of civilized settlements that a policy should have been initiated which more than aught else has been the fruitful source of our Indian complications. I refer, of course, to the policy of dealing with the various Indian tribes as separate nationalities, of relegating them by treaty stipulations to the occupancy of immense reservations in the West, and of encouraging them to live a savage life, undisturbed by any earnest and well-directed efforts to bring them under the influences of civilization. The unsatisfactory results which have sprung from this policy are becoming apparent to all. As the white settlements have crowded the borders of the reservations, the Indians, sometimes contentedly and sometimes against their will, have been transferred to other hunting grounds from which they have again been dislodged whenever their newfound homes have been desired by the adventurous settlers. These removals and the frontier collisions by which they have often been preceded have led to frequent and disastrous conflicts between the races. It is profitless to discuss here which of them has been chiefly responsible for the disturbances whose recital occupies so large a space upon the pages of our history. We have to deal with the appalling fact that though thousands of lives have been sacrificed and hundreds of millions of dollars expended in the attempt to solve the Indian problem, it has until within the past few years seemed scarcely nearer a solution than it was half a century ago. But the government has of late been cautiously but steadily feeling its way to the adoption of a policy which has already produced gratifying results and which, in my judgment, is likely, if Congress and the executive accord in its support, to relieve us ere long from the difficulties which have hitherto beset us. For the success of the efforts now making to introduce among the Indians the customs and pursuits of civilized life, and gradually to absorb them into the mass of our citizens, sharing their rights and holden to their responsibilities, there is imperative need for legislative action. My suggestions in that regard will be chiefly such as having been already called to the attention of Congress and have received to some extent its consideration. First, I recommend the passage of an act making the laws of the various states and territories applicable to the Indian reservations within their borders and extending the laws of the state of Arkansas to the portion of the Indian territory not occupied by the 5 civilized tribes. The Indian should receive the protection of the law. He should be allowed to maintain in court his rights of person and property. He has repeatedly begged for this privilege. Its exercise will be very valuable to him in his progress towards civilization. Second, of even greater importance, is a measure which has been frequently recommended by my predecessors in office, and in furtherance of which several bills have been from time to time introduced in both houses of Congress: the enactment of a general law permitting the allotment in severalty to such Indians, at least as desired, of a reasonable quantity of land secured to them by patent and for their own protection made unalienable for 20 or 25 years, is demanded for their present welfare and their permanent advancement. In return for such considerate action on part of the government, there is reason to believe that the Indians in large numbers would be persuaded to sever their tribal relations and to engage at once in agricultural pursuits. Many of them realize the fact that their hunting days are over, and that it is now for their best interest to conform their manner of life to the new order of things. By no greater inducement than the assurance of permanent title to the soil can they be led to engage in the occupation of tilling it. The well-attested reports of their increasing interest in husbandry justify the hope and belief that the enactment of such a statute as I recommend would be at once attended with gratifying result. A resort to the allotment system would have a direct and powerful influence in dissolving the tribal bond, which is so prominent a feature of savage life, and which tends so strongly to perpetuate it. Third, I advise a liberal appropriation for the support of Indian schools, because of my confident belief that such a course is consistent with the wisest economy. They are doubtless much more potent for good than the day schools upon the reservation, as the peoples are altogether separated from the surroundings of savage life and brought into constant contact with civilization. There is so much to break down here from this speech, including the allotment of lands, the perception of the Indian savage, and so on, but this is how we got to the American Indian boarding schools. While religious convents and residential schools for educating Native Americans had existed before this point in time, what the very humane and progressive Chester A. Arthur presidency was suggesting was an industrialized version of those systems that, out of a perceived mercy, would not be committing a physical genocide, and instead a cultural genocide for the sake of both the United States and the indigenous tribes. In short, ladies and gentlemen, this was a policy of forced assimilation that, as you've probably figured out by now, didn't turn out so well. A chief architect of the American Indian boarding school system was former U.S. Army Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt, who literally made a school system based on the prison for Native Americans. In a speech he gave in 1892, Pratt proclaimed that a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Pratt's Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which had taken over an abandoned military base for schooling in 1879, became the golden standard template for over 300 Indian boarding schools across the United States in the decades that followed after. Boys and girls were forced to cut their hair regardless of their tradition or cultural practices. All children were given European names, all children were forced to speak English only, and were forbidden to even bring up anything about their languages, homes, and cultures. A lot of these schools became overcrowded and unsanitary, leading to outbreaks of diseases including measles and tuberculosis, which were essentially death sentences at the time. Malnutrition and starvation became a standard for many students. Children who couldn't run away often killed themselves. There are survivor stories of people being forced to bury their classmates and friends in school cemeteries when bodies were found. Survivors have said physical punishments were very common, with some children dying from their wounds because the wounds would fester. Both boys and girls were raped by staff. Things were just so bad that a survey in 1928 found that death rates, not literacy rates or grades or whatever, the rate of Native Americans dying in these schools was at least 6 times higher compared to other groups in the United States. Oftentimes, thousands of these children wouldn't even make it back to their families or homes alive, which would just upend a lot of the social and familial structure that a lot of tribes relied on. You might be wondering at this point what they were actually taught. Many of the classes offered to these students in these abominable schools focused on farming and homesteading, with an emphasis on conforming to American civilization. The quality of education, as you might guess, was very subpar. Of course, resistance in the public sphere and academia was committed to by notable indigenous individuals such as the Kalasa in the early 20th century, but unfortunately the tide of history and government would overwhelm these instances of resistance well into the 1970s, when boarding schools were still functioning at the same level of quality that they were in the 1890s. It wasn't until the Jimmy Carter administration that the Indian Child Welfare Act was finally passed by Congress in 1978, audaciously giving Native American parents the legal right to refuse their children being placed into a boarding school. What I can't fail to mention before the end of this video is that Canada's Prime Ministers John Macdonald and Mackenzie Bowell would both follow President Chester A. Arthur's lead in enacting this brutal cultural genocide back in the late 19th century. We are still finding mass graves of children up in Canada to this day, with many more suspected sites, and if you think this is ancient history, the last boarding school for First Nations children in Canada actually closed in 1997. Just like many of its American counterparts, Canadian schools would be compulsory for First Nations children. Families would essentially be separated from their children due to the intentional long distances put between the schools and the children's homes. It was a miracle if parents could successfully even visit their children at these schools. Children would be discouraged from using their native languages, and instead forced to speak English or French. There were incredibly unfair and cruel punishments for non-conforming students or children that resulted in malnutrition, starvation, disease, rape, and other forms of horrendous physical abuse. And again, just like their United States counterparts, this cruel schooling system in Canada hasn't helped the Native communities, nor the actual countries or governments in any shape or form, as Chester A. Arthur postulated.
This is the basement of the residential school. On this side was where the staff ate.
What kind of foods did they have in here?
They had the best. They had fruit. They had salads and meats, just the best. But A different story for the residents.
We were used to rabbit, deer meat, and stuff like that. And here it was like the white man's food.
Could you guys ever refuse to eat?
Yes.
Yes, we did.
Oh, yeah.
I had sat beside a young girl one time when she was throwing up because it was really lumpy porridge, and then it hit us like this real hard. And we had to eat her. We still had to eat her vomit.
Studies over the years have shown an increase in PTSD, alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide rates, and other health issues that didn't exactly translate into benefits for literally anyone, and in fact had a direct impact on the abysmal quality of life that we see today on Indian reservations. There's actually a really interesting scene in the TV show The Sopranos, where New Jersey mobsters are talking about Native Americans.
The New Jersey Council of Indian Affairs has announced plans to disrupt Monday's Columbus Day Parade in Newark. Council Chairman Del Redclay, professor of cultural anthropology
Stop blowing your nose, I want to hear this.
Council members and supporters will lie down in the path of Columbus Day marches, quote, in protest of Columbus's role in the genocide of America's native peoples, unquote. To launch their protest, the Native Americans and their sympathizers plan to begin a death watch tomorrow over the statue of Columbus in Christopher Columbus Park.
Some fucking balls bad-mouthing America, especially now.
I thought Columbus was the hero of America.
Oh, see, it's these Indians and the commie fucks. They want to paint Columbus as a slave trader instead of an explorer.
You gotta admit, they did get massacred, the Indians.
It's not like we didn't give them a bunch of shit to make up for that.
Land, reservations,
And now they got the casinos.
The fuck we ever get we didn't have to work our balls off for? I won't mind sitting on my ass all day, smoking mushrooms and collecting government checks.
Today, the majority of American Indian reservations live 40 to 60% below the poverty line, with poverty rates being much higher than the national average, with 8 out of 10 individuals being unemployed. Native-owned casinos and wealth aren't exactly the norm for most families. This rather common viewpoint is like looking at Bill Gates and thinking every white guy has billions of dollars, which obviously isn't true. Educational and financial infrastructure is virtually non-existent on reservations. 40% of the housing present on reservations is considered inadequate according to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Gang violence, incredibly high rates of drug abuse exacerbated by cartel activity, and homelessness in these sordid environments are unfortunately present, with the average life expectancy being 5 years lower than many other groups in America. In 2011, if you were living on a reservation, you were somehow 500% more likely to die from tuberculosis compared to the rest of the United States. Cultural sites are often at risk due to private interest or corporate greed, as well with the health of ecosystems. And the list just goes on and on and on. One has to wonder, if these boarding schools had not existed and the shattered remnants of these tribal communities were allowed to try to heal, how things would have looked. But this was a very brief history of the atrocious American Indian boarding school system, and I really hope this gave you information you had not known about before, and I do earnestly hope that you share this information with others, as knowledge is power. Again, I would just recommend looking at these sources if you want to look into some of this history we're talking about. Let me know down in the comments below what you'd like me to cover next, and I will see you guys next time.